So last Sunday, 37 years later, I returned to Bourbon Street with Eddie Bernstein again. But this time we came for a very different purpose. We were on a civil rights pilgrimage throughout the South with a group of rabbis and other leaders of the Masorti conservative movement, as well as Jews of color. And we came to really try to understand some of our history and some of what really took place, and to see it with our own eyes. If you want to really understand something, you actually need to go there. We visited plantations. We went to museums about slavery, racism, and mass incarceration. And now I have a deeper understanding of the history of the United States. It's not the story that I learned in high school and in college when I took courses in American history. It's actually a really different history. And I really can't recommend enough to this book, 1619. I don't know if anyone's heard of it or read it. Even if you just read the first chapter, it really explains how this country was built. And it's different from the story I was taught, which was a very heroic story of many things, of our founding fathers who built this country with great ideas of freedom, of democracy for all. But that's really not what they created. It was freedom and democracy for some. And it left things like slavery enshrined in our Constitution. This benefited not only the South, but people in the North. Everyone in this country who is white and wealthy benefited, and I'm sorry to say that Jews also benefited. This country's wealth, its cities, its streets, its institutions, pretty much everything built up until emancipation in 1865, and even you could argue somewhat afterwards, everything that was built by slaves. When you see a brick downtown, in the street, anywhere in old buildings, those bricks were made in the South by slaves, often by children. Seeing slavery up close was absolutely horrifying. It was a horror every single day for the slaves. And it's an abuse that lasted for centuries. It was worse than I kind of imagined in my mind. It was not just the initial kidnapping and taking of people from Africa, 12.5 million people. But it was then this entire international slave trade that brought, by the middle of the 19th century to the United States, 4.5 million slaves, as well as those throughout the world. But it didn't end there. There was a domestic slave trade that continued, even once people were brought here. There were things like torture built into the system. There was unbelievable amounts of abuse. There was the separation of families, where you could be ripped out of your family at any time, parents, children, all the time. And there were incredible amounts of every form of mistreatment, including pretty much constant sexual violence. And one of the reasons for sexual violence was beyond the actual violence, but there was greed involved. And I never thought about this. It was in the master's best interest to participate, and often they did it, because the more slaves that were born, the more workers now the master had. And so it was in their own monetary best interest to engage in this. Sexual violence translated into money. We also spent time learning about the slave codes. And by the way, there's a long history of this, starting in the 15th century with laws that are passed by the Catholic Church that said that you can go anywhere in the world and Christianize people and take them as slaves, etc. I don't have time for all of the history, but it's really unbelievable. I'll pause in a few places like the slave codes, which dehumanized blacks in general, whether you were a free black in the North or enslaved in the South. White, wealthy slave owners built a system that not just oppressed the slaves, but actually poor whites. And they got the poor whites to feel that they weren't at the bottom of the ladder, right? Blacks were at the bottom, so they felt a little bit superior. They were hired often on slave patrols, which would capture runaway slaves, which ensured slaves never left their plantations, would abuse them, and also kill them. These were forerunners of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But the teaching of hate became not just an ideology, but it was actually put into practice after the Civil War, when racism, after a few years of the possibility of some reconciliation, these laws immediately wiped away any hope for a chance at an equal future. In the 1890s, voting literacy tests were given to blacks to disenfranchise them for voting. And I went to one of the museums in Montgomery, Alabama. You could take the test. The first question is, how many seeds are in a watermelon? One of the other questions, how many bubbles are on a bar of soap? You can imagine standing there trying to take this test so that you could vote. And then came a most horrific time in American history, the era of lynchings. Blacks lynched by mobs for almost any reason, for looking at someone, for annoying someone, for frightening a white person. These are the actual reasons. One of them, I sort of in my mind thought that this period was confined to like the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It couldn't have gone on that long, but it continued throughout the period between the world wars. And then it continued even after that. We know of Jewish people like Leo Frank who was lynched, but this was thousands and thousands of people. In 1948, here's an example. Robert Mallard, a prosperous farmer, was lynched near Lyons, Georgia. His crime was that he voted. This lynching not only was horrific in itself, which it was, and we saw pictures, and some of them were made into postcards, literally, that they would sell, but instilled unbelievable fear in the population, which caused them to move into other places, again separating families, again continuing this abuse. And all of it fed right into the Jim Crow laws. Even after Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, it didn't end the pervasive racism. It didn't fix the injustices done to blacks. It didn't help the blacks who suffered. It didn't repair problems. It actually continued and prevented blacks from being able to buy good homes after World War II. Many of them served. Didn't matter if they were in their uniform. They couldn't buy homes. They were redlined after districts when suburbia exploded, and they were left behind. Instead of getting better, it got worse. All of this led to the mass incarceration of blacks, just shy of 500,000 people still today, some for possessing crimes like owning or possessing a drug, which are legal today in large swaths of the country, but they sit in jail. When you add police abuse to all of this, you can see where we are. I have to say that I learned more this week, and I've only shared a fraction of what I learned. Now, does the Torah abolish slavery? No, it doesn't. Even though the Israelite people are born out of slavery, right? We were slaves in Egypt. We say over and over again, we leave Egypt. You would expect that to be one of the laws. Didn't happen. It's disappointing to say the least. Now, I always like to give every person and every text l'chaf zchut and look at them from the benefit of the doubt. And so, of course, when we judge the Torah, we have to remember that it was written thousands of years ago. And we should also realize that slavery didn't end in America till 1865, and it continues in parts of the world. So first of all, I always like to remind myself of three things. One, the Torah that we just read from is not Judaism. We don't practice exactly what the Torah states. We developed a practice and a tradition and a religion based on the Torah, but one that has evolved and developed after thousands of years. Second, it's important to realize, just like every one of us, just like every text, the Torah is not perfect. I know our ancestors thought about it as perfect, but maybe they were thinking about it more in this evolving way. It's not perfect. In places, its perspective is problematic. We weren't the first ones to realize that. Our rabbis looked at the Torah, knew there were problems, reinterpreted the text. And it's a process that continues till this day, especially in our movement in Judaism. And third, we should realize the Torah was not written for today. Imagine if creation opened up with an explanation of the quarks and what are they called? All those subatomic particles that exploded out of the Big Bang. The people reading the Torah thousands of years ago would have said, what are you talking about? Right? The Torah was written for the time in which it was written. And thousands of years ago, we should realize the Torah for its time was a revolution. It didn't abolish slavery, but it gave slaves rights and protections, something that was not true in our country until the middle of the 19th century. I'll give you an example from Parashat Mishpatim a few weeks ago. We read that if a slave was severely injured by the slave's master, the master would have to free the slave. What was the law in America? What was the law in America? You could maim, wound, or even kill your slave. There would be absolutely no prosecution, nothing. They were your property. And perhaps the most important law that the Torah legislates is Shabbat. Everyone gets off on Shabbat, and it mentions explicitly that slaves have rights on Shabbat. They get the day off. Now, the mitzvah of Shabbat appears in so many places in the Torah and is emphasized. And it's right in our Parashah, right in the beginning, which is interesting. We're building the Mishkan, sacred space, but of course we start with sacred time. We start with Shabbat. What does the Torah say? Sheshet yamim te'asa melacha. It first gives you the other side of Shabbat. You can't experience Shabbat unless you're working on the other days, or studying, or learning, or engaged in something. Even if you're independently wealthy, the Torah says, stop, do something, volunteer, make sure you're engaged in work. Now, it doesn't say, right, it says te'aseh, you have to be working. Now, I wanted to go back to my friend Eddie Bernstein, who's a rabbi. We're talking about the Parashah, and he said, quoting another rabbi, Moshe Berger, that you should remind yourself that the Torah is mostly about, and the commentaries are mostly about, the other days of the week. 83% of the week is not Shabbat. And most of the laws of our tradition and the Talmud deal with those days of the week. The Talmud discusses digging ditches, building safe buildings, paying workers fair and timely wages, among some of the day-to-day activities that help us create responsible and just communities. Now that's the Torah that helps us think about how to engage a little bit more in racial justice by exploring how to make a difference for all people, for all races in this country. We start, I think, to live up to some of the values that are embedded in our tradition. The notion of kavod habriot, of honoring all human beings and seeing them as created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of the divine. Our community's been engaged in this racial justice work on our own and through the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, working for housing, which especially impacts the Black community. I'm really proud of our efforts and our incredible lay leadership who have been championing them. During our Racial Justice Shabbat in January, we heard from people who were formerly incarcerated the problems with our broken justice system. And I think it inspired me and hopefully many of us to do more. My trip with Jews of color helped me appreciate how people of different races experience living in our country. They invited our group to think about our own biases, which everyone has, and how our community as a shul welcomes Jews of color. We have more work to do. Our tradition is not perfect, but each generation has come to explore how to make the world a more just place. And as Jews, we think about how we can do that internally in our community and how we can do that in the world. Shabbat Shalom.